will now move to the motion before the House tonight, which is this House regrets blaming Wall Street for the global financial crisis. And I now look to the first speaker, the Secretary, Molly Greenwood, St Hilda's College, to open the case for the proposition.
I think that most of us in the room will have quite an instinctual response to this motion, because for so long it's been perhaps the easiest way out to blame the bankers for everything that went wrong in 2008. The motion is not asking whether we should blame the bankers, though. It's asking whether we regret doing it. Whether now, free of the worst and most immediate impacts of the crash, we feel it's somewhat unfair to do so, or that it is somehow not quite in keeping with the whole truth of the matter. But first, it falls upon me to introduce the opposition in the chamber tonight. First is Stephen Horvath, a second-year history and politics student at New College and the treasurer of the Oxford Union. Order of seniority meant that Stephen was allowed to choose which side he wanted to speak on first. But I will gladly allow the treasurer to rail against those who are in charge of the money. The second opposition speaker is Steve Eisman, who was portrayed by Steve Carroll in The Big Short and made $100 million from the 2008 crisis, and is current managing director at Neuberger Berman. Dr. Yago Venugopal Reddy was the governor of the Reserve Bank of India during the 2008 crash, and was awarded the second highest civilian honour for his work. Closing the opposition tonight is the Finance Minister of Iceland from 2005 to 2009, and currently Assistant Director General of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Madam President, these are your speakers, and they are most welcome. One thing that is undeniable is that Wall Street is not solely to blame. Since the finger was pointed so vehemently, the public attitude towards the financial sector has changed for the worse, and has distracted from the fact that none of this could have happened to the extent that it did, were it not for an atmosphere and culture of decreased deregulation and a blasé attitude from the governments in the United States and the world regarding the activities of the banking sector. Much of this began with the Financial Services Modernization Act of 1999, which repealed crucial parts of the Glass-Steagall legislation. This was part of the US Banking Act of 1933, and its most significant provision was that it outlined the separation of commercial and investment banking. It created a line between the two that prevented the kind of confusing, ominous mixing that we would see years later, that leaves consumers vulnerable to the high-risk but financially necessary activities of traders. Bill Clinton signed this into law. It might be good to know that Clinton received almost $40 million worth of donations from the financial sector during his 1992 and 1996 presidential bids. During the Buckley versus Valeo case in the US Supreme Court, the case that made unlimited election spending possible, Justice Byron White recognized that Congress had noted such huge spending possibilities as a mortal danger against which effective preventative and curative steps must be taken. And yet, it continues. Hillary Clinton also received just over $20 million over her 2 runs from the financial sector. Bush, Rubio, and Romney all received significant donations from Wall Street, the money coming from the biggest banks, including Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan, Chase, Bank of America Merrill Lynch, Wells Fargo, and Goldman Sachs. You'll notice you don't hear some of those names anymore, since they fell victim to the crash in an ironic and secular way through their extensive donations. What can be gleaned from this is that politicians were receiving huge amounts of money to support their runs for office. I imagine there simply was not the incentive to place strict regulations on the banks that were helping them out so much. It is perhaps worse than if I were to say that simply governments were allowing the banks to do as they pleased. Instead, it was candidates in elections who needed the funds. I'm happy to report that according to Rule 33AI18, a person shall have committed electoral malpractice if they're spending money on an election or candidate, so I do hope my honourable opposition, the Treasurer, has turned down any of his offers from Goldman Sachs. Much of the resentment towards the subprime mortgage crisis stems very much from the feeling of being cheated. The perception that the dirty, greedy banks lied to individuals with the sole intention of causing them to lose everything at a later date. Of course, this was not the motive. It was condescending to individuals to assume that they had no idea of the potential risks. In a highly competitive financial world, where the profit to power is a positive correlation, where businesses and firms must constantly fight to survive, I find it difficult to entirely condemn those who do as much as they can within the law, What I do condemn, however, is the law not providing sufficient regulation to ensure that loopholes cannot be manipulated and that consumers are protected. It's the job of the professionals, not individual consumers, to be experts in complicated financial and corporate law. Where were those experts when they were most needed to ensure consumers were covered? As already explained, the complacent attitudes towards the financial sector on behalf of those in the highest office have now caused significant damage to the global economy from which we've only just recovered. In the wake of the crash, governments around the world emptied global savings by pouring money into the US, a deeply necessary, yet in the short term, destructive response. We should regret blaming Wall Street because every newspaper article, every television broadcast, every political commentator who does so distracts from the real problem. The fact that governments and law enforcement failed in their duty to protect consumers from a threat that was inevitable, allowing financial institutions too long a leash with the US housing market. The deregulation began many years ago, and its effects are still being felt. I regret the vehement blame placed on the bankers, who are in no particular position to change the institution, but politicians are, and it's up to them to ensure the kind of disaster that we saw in 2008 is prevented in the future. I will hope you vote with the proposition tonight. Thank you very much.